Colonel MacGregor, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Sure. Happy to be here.
So, over the past few weeks, Ukraine more and more is ramping up their attacks within Russia, specifically targeting Moscow. What do you think is the real point of this? Is it to cause terror among the citizens? Is it to try to weaken support for Putin, or what do you think the drone attacks into Russia are really about?
I would regard what the Ukrainians are doing at this point, and I really should say the Zelensky regime, what it is doing, is committing acts of desperation, and they're in terrible condition right now. I received some interesting overhead imagery that was sent to me about Ukraine, and it was very interesting because the overhead imagery depicted 123,000 freshly dug graves in Ukraine for Ukrainian soldiers, and talked about 400,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. This was kind of shocking to me. I had always believed that it was at least 300,000 to 350,000 dead, but I had not seen this assertion. And this comes from a very reliable source. And the idea of more freshly dug graves is deeply disturbing because we see more and more evidence that the Zelensky regime insists on throwing away lives in these pointless attacks on Russian defenses simply as a way to try and persuade people in the West that they are in good shape, they're still fighting, and that we should continue to support them regardless of whatever else they hear. That's a terrible price to pay, and I don't think Ukraine can pay it much longer.
Yeah, they're eventually going to run out of bodies and bullets. Wasn't it the thing that brought down George Bush Jr.'s presidential rating was actually cameras catching all of the bodies coming back to the United States. They realized, wait a minute, we're losing a lot of really good men and women over a fight that nobody really understands. Do you think all these bodies coming back, these fresh graves, does this have anything to do with why Zelensky has suspended presidential elections in Ukraine?
Well, Zelensky is in very poor shape politically. I don't think he's very popular inside his own country. We keep insisting that his approval ratings are high, but then again, the same people that tell you that are telling you that the Ukrainians are winning, that with just a little more help, they can be pushed over the finish line and drive the evil Russians out and so forth. There's no chance of any of that happening. That's absurd. The other thing that came through in this report that I thought was extremely disturbing is this business of amputees. Somebody told me recently that I guess they've checked the hospitals and the wards and so forth. There are roughly 60,000 amputations of limbs from Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, this is catastrophic. Again, these are people that will never go back to active duty, and that's the other problem. It's one thing to be wounded if you can recover from it and be returned to active duty. It's quite another when you're so severely wounded, there's no chance of ever coming back again. I think that inside Ukraine, the truth is out. There are enormous problems with recruiting. The secret police is more and more heavily engaged, dragging people kicking and screaming into vans and driving them off to fight in the Ukrainian army. The worst part, of course, is that the people that were trained, that knew anything about their professions, are largely gone or dead. In other words, they've either been wounded or killed, or they've simply vanished. Maybe some of them have surrendered. We do know that surrenders are up, and that's not because Ukrainians don't lack for guts. They are very courageous people. That's not the issue. But Ukrainian commanders look at their units and they have 30, 40, 50 people severely wounded. Their chain of command tells them, well, we can't evacuate you. We can't get them out. At which point in time, he's got to make a decision. Does he let the wounded die? Or does he say, well, I've got about 150 men here or 200 men. I'm going to surrender because I don't want the wounded to die. And the Russians have been good about one thing in particular, and that is they've treated all of the Ukrainians that have surrendered very well. So the Ukrainians know they're not going to be mistreated. They're not going to be murdered or anything else. All of these things point to an imminent collapse of the Ukrainian military. And one would expect something similar eventually with the government. And I don't know what happens next, but I can't imagine anything good happening, because the notion that we can continue the aid and that somehow or another there'll be a magical turnaround is just nonsense.
Yeah. The one thing that is concerning that you and I spoke a little bit about before hitting record is you have people like Senator Mitt Romney of Utah pushing forward a new legislative bill to basically hijack and take over the Black Sea. Can you tell us more about that? Because it's pretty concerning.
Well, this is unfortunately pretty typical for the Washington political class. Let me explain something. There's a thing called the Montreux Convention. It was signed in 1936 in July, went into force in November. This convention gives enormous authority, with good reason, to the Turks, who control the Bosporus, the Straits. And effectively, it says that warships, first of all ships that are involved in commercial practices, in other words, moving freight, moving cargo, they can all pass without interference. There will be no disruptions to commercial traffic. However, it says if the Russians, for instance, want to move vessels through the Straits, they can move a certain number through, and then those vessels at some future point, if their home port is in the Black Sea, they can come back through. But that otherwise, foreign ships from the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, from any of the NATO navies, they can't move more than 21 ships through there. And the convention gives the Turks the right to effectively say, we don't want to let you in if we choose not to. At the same time, they can turn to the Russians and refuse them re-entry. If they say, well, the ships that you brought out are not really home ported in the Black Sea, then you can't return your ships to it. Russians had some aircraft carriers, not aircraft carriers as we understand them, that weigh 100,000 tons. These are much smaller, but nevertheless, they carried helicopters and missiles and so forth. And they had been built in Sevastopol in the Black Sea, but they were not home based there. So when they tried to return these ships, the Turks told them, no, you can't do it. And so they had to take other routes to get where they needed to go. I think most of them sailed around to Vladivostok, some sailed up to the Baltic. But what the senator wants to do is he wants to create a permanent U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea. Well, I think under the terms of the convention, that's probably impossible. In other words, the Turks aren't going to let large numbers of U.S. naval ships, combatant ships, into the Black Sea. That's number one. Number two, in addition to the Montreux Convention, you have the Russian view of the Black Sea, which is it's a Russian lake. They look at the Black Sea the same way we look at Lake Erie or Lake Michigan. These are inland lakes that we control. If it were possible for Russian warships to sail down the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes, I'm quite certain that the American people would be very concerned about that and would object to it. Well, you have a similar attitude in Russia. So I think what's happened here are two things. First of all, this is an opportunity for senators to grandstand, to make irresponsible recommendations, to push through legislation that is meaningless and has no chance of being implemented. And then secondly, no admiral in the United States Navy in his right mind would send large combatant vessels into the Black Sea, because it is in strategic terms a puddle. You can't hide anything in the Black Sea. There's nowhere to retreat. So anything that goes in there that from the United States Navy or other NATO navies can easily be identified and sunk. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is more hot air from one of the larger windbags in Washington, Mitt Romney. And people need to pay attention to it, because it's this kind of stupidity. It's not really stupidity as much as it is arrogance and self-importance. It can put a lot of American sailors, Marines, soldiers, airmen at risk unnecessarily. And this is an example of where if foolish admirals exist and want to try and push their way through, they may be able to do it. I don't know, but I still don't think the Turks would sign on for it, and they ultimately control the Straits.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from living in Utah, I don't believe Senator Romney will be Senator Romney next year, but different story. Thank you for helping us better understand that. Yeah, the Black Sea just is not as big as many would believe, and you put something big enough, it just becomes a target. Now, you had put out a new article, and I've been reading that Poland is getting very on edge about the Wagner mercenary group doing Belarusian armed forces training
Yeah.
close to their border. Does Poland have a reason to worry about Belarus? And secondly, in the article that you authored, you suggested that Poland might be eager to jump into this Ukraine conflict because they believe ultimately Washington, D.C. would back them. Can you give us an idea of what's going on in Poland and also why you think Poland may be getting braver in their desire to push into Ukraine?
Well, first of all, the Poles do not lack for bravery. They're very brave people. They're very excellent soldiers. I would simply say on this particular point that the Polish government doesn't sound like a great repository of common sense, but that's my personal opinion. The Poles have made no secret of the fact that they regard large parts of Western Ukraine and parts of Belarusia as areas that were once part of the so-called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest state in Europe for most of the period between 1459, when it was established, and let us say the early 1700s or late 1600s. Ultimately, the whole thing fell apart for reasons of internal strife and civil war and disagreements. The idea was eventually to bring in what we today refer to as Lithuania, which was at least half of contemporary White Russia, Ukraine, and Poland together in one great state. It all fell apart before those goals could be realized in 1794, and Poland vanished from the map of Europe. The Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians did not march into Poland with the idea of harming the Poles. They marched in to put an end to Poland because it was seen as a catalyst for war, and its government was viewed as essentially an extension of the French Revolution at the time, which nobody wanted to spread to Central East Europe. That may or may not have all been true, but the point is that that was the end of Poland, at least until after World War I. Now, the Poles have since been interested in regaining everything. They had a war with the Soviets in 1920 where they absolutely smashed the Soviet military out in front of Warsaw, drove the Soviets hundreds of miles back into Russia, and they did acquire some of the lost territory. That, of course, was overturned in 1939 when once again Poland was partitioned, and Poland largely vanished as an actor on the international stage until 1945, and then it became a puppet state. Now, the reason I'm bringing all of that up is so that people understand that there are plenty of Poles and Lithuanians in Vilnius and in Warsaw who are looking at what's happening in Ukraine. They see Ukraine is collapsing. Ukraine is losing. It's not going to win. And so they're saying, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to sit here and let it all fall apart? Or are we going to exploit the collapse of Ukraine to move in and seize territory, which is rightfully ours anyway? And they could also build this as, well, you know, we're going in to rescue what's left of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. If you're sitting in Minsk, which used to be part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and which is now the capital of Belarusia, and you're Mr. Lukashenko, you're very concerned because Poland is a stone's throw away. It's an hour or two, less than that, from the Polish border to Minsk, the Belarusian capital. So the question is, well, if this is going to happen in Ukraine, let's take advantage of it. And then there is this assumption that if the Poles, the Lithuanians, and some Ukrainians get together and they carve out or try to carve out this new safe zone or security zone or whatever they're going to call it in Western Ukraine, on the grounds that they're protecting Ukrainians and saving it from total absorption or destruction. Once they come into contact with Russian forces, which I think is inevitable, and they start to be systematically annihilated, the assumption is, well, we'll all rush to their defense. United States Army, some of which is sitting in Romania, some of which is in Lithuania and Poland, will then cross the border and bolster the Polish-Lithuanian position. Well, I guess that's possible. The fact that President Biden very recently signed an executive order granting Americans in uniform in Ukraine hazard pay, which is effectively what we used to call combat pay, suggests to the Russians that we're quite ready to go into Ukraine. Now they know we've got people on the ground in Ukraine. They've always known that. And we no doubt have taken casualties, although we've managed to keep that very quiet.